on October 12, 1890, in the grey stone corridors of Whitmore Manor in Lancashire, England, something was discovered that would challenge everything we understand about the boundaries between life and death. The manor's east wing had been sealed since 1871 following a structural fire, but when workmen finally broke through the wax seals and rusted locks, they found more than water-damaged furniture and moth-eaten tapestries. In a rosewood writing desk, perfectly preserved despite 2 decades of neglect, lay bundled stacks of letters tied with black ribbon, each one meticulously dated and signed by 13-year-old Alice Thornton. What made these letters impossible, what drew the immediate attention of physician and alienist Dr. Edmund Harwick, was not their pristine condition or their eloquent prose, but their recipients. Every single letter was addressed to someone who had been dead for years. But before we dive into this nightmare, if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. To understand the magnitude of what happened to Alice Thornton, one must first understand the family from which she came. The Thorntons had established themselves as textile magnates in Lancashire during the 1820s, their mills employing nearly 1/3 of Whitmore's population by 1880. Charles Thornton, Alice's father, was a man of impeccable reputation, serving as both magistrate and benefactor to numerous local charities, while her mother, Eleanor, née Ashworth, came from an equally distinguished Manchester banking family. Alice, born on March 15, 1877, was their only child after 2 stillbirths, and contemporary accounts describe her early years as remarkably ordinary, even idyllic. She displayed a keen intelligence, excelling in French and piano under the tutelage of her governess, Margaret Fielding, and was known throughout Whitmore for her cheerful disposition and particular kindness to the servants' children, with whom she would secretly share sweets from her father's study. But everything changed during the winter of 1889, when scarlet fever descended upon Lancashire with a virulence that medical authorities would later describe as unprecedented. The epidemic claimed 47 lives in Whitmore alone between November and January, with children comprising the vast majority of victims. Alice fell ill on December 3, 1889, exactly 3 days after attending the funeral of her closest friend, Catherine Wellspring, who had succumbed to the disease. Dr. Edmund Harwick's medical notes, preserved in the Lancashire Medical Archive, describe Alice's condition as grave beyond reasonable hope of recovery by December 7th. Her fever reached 106 degrees Fahrenheit. She experienced severe delirium, and most alarmingly, her pulse became so faint that on 2 occasions, attending nurses believed she had died. Eleanor Thornton would later testify that on the night of December 10th, Alice's breathing stopped entirely for what she swore was no less than 3 full minutes, during which time the child's lips turned blue and her body grew cold to the touch. Yet somehow, impossibly, just as Dr. Harwick was preparing to record the time of death, Alice suddenly gasped. Her eyes flew open, and she spoke a single sentence that would haunt everyone present. "They're all here with me now." Her recovery was nothing short of miraculous, with her fever breaking within hours and her strength returning at a rate Dr. Harwick documented as medically inexplicable. By Christmas Day, Alice was walking the manor grounds. Though servants would later report she seemed to pause frequently, tilting her head as if listening to conversations no one else could hear. Margaret Fielding's diary, discovered in 1923, contains a particularly disturbing entry from January 2nd, 1890. Alice has returned to us in body, but something fundamental has changed. She speaks of people who aren't there, knows things she couldn't possibly know, and worst of all, she seems entirely untroubled by it, as if walking between two worlds is the most natural thing imaginable. The first documented evidence of Alice Thornton's impossible correspondence was discovered by Margaret Fielding on January 14, 1890, when she entered Alice's room to collect her French composition exercises and found instead a neat stack of letters on the writing desk, each one carefully sealed with black wax. What initially appeared to be a touching if morbid exercise in grief processing quickly revealed itself as something far more disturbing when Miss Fielding examined the addresses. The first letter was directed to Mrs. Catherine Wellspring, Plot 47, Whitmore Cemetery. Alice's recently deceased friend, but the subsequent correspondences were addressed to individuals who had died years, even decades, before Alice's birth. Mr. Josiah Blackwood, deceased, 1867. Miss Adelaide Thornton, deceased, 1852. And most unnervingly, baby William Ashworth, deceased, 1831, who would have been Eleanor Thornton's uncle, dead nearly 50 years before Alice was even conceived. The content of these letters, meticulously preserved in Dr. Harwick's case files, defied all rational explanation. In her letter to Adelaide Thornton, a great-aunt who had died of consumption 38 years prior, Alice wrote, "I understand now why you keep returning to the blue room on the 3rd floor. The locket you hid beneath the floorboard near the window is still there, just as you described, though the portrait inside has faded terribly." When Charles Thornton, initially dismissive of what he termed a child's peculiar method of processing trauma, ordered the blue room searched, workers discovered beneath a loose floorboard a gold locket containing a deteriorated daguerreotype of a young man in military uniform, an item that no living member of the household knew existed. Even more disturbing was Alice's correspondence with Josiah Blackwood, in which she detailed conversations about his death. "You needn't feel guilty about the fire anymore, Mr. Blackwood. I've told no one that you were smoking in the East Wing that night, though you really should stop blaming yourself after 23 years." The Thornton family had always believed the 1867 fire was caused by a knocked-over oil lamp, but Alice's letter contained specific details about Blackwood's final moments that subsequent investigation with the County Records Office confirmed as accurate. Despite these records being sealed in municipal archives Alice had never accessed, Charles and Eleanor Thornton, desperate to maintain both social standing and sanity, initially instructed the household staff to ignore what they termed their daughter's overactive imagination following her illness. But Margaret Fielding's concerns could not be so easily dismissed. Her diary entries from late January reveal mounting alarm. "Alice knows things that are impossible. Yesterday she told me that my own grandmother, dead these 15 years, wanted me to know she forgave me for breaking the China shepherdess. I had never told a soul about that incident from my childhood. When I asked Alice how she could possibly know this, she simply smiled and said, 'Grandmother Fielding told me herself. She visits quite often now.'" By February of 1890, what had begun as occasional letters had escalated into a torrential outpouring of correspondence that consumed nearly all of Alice Thornton's waking hours. Margaret Fielding's meticulous records indicate that between February 1st and March 31st, Alice produced no fewer than 137 letters, sometimes writing through the entire night by candlelight, her pen scratching across page after page with fevered intensity. The content of these missives grew increasingly detailed and intimate, describing elaborate conversations with the deceased that Alice insisted were occurring in real time. In a letter dated February 18th to someone identified only as Thomas, the cholera victim of 1854, Alice wrote, "I told Mother exactly as you instructed about the silver you buried beneath the old oak, though she didn't believe me until Father's men dug it up this morning, all 47 pounds sterling still wrapped in the oilcloth you described." But what transformed the household's skepticism into genuine terror was the discovery made by the housemaid, Sarah Whitley, on the morning of February 24th. Upon entering Alice's room to deliver fresh linens, she found Alice's locked writing desk drawer contained 3 letters addressed to the child, each written in different hands, each signed by individuals whose deaths were matters of public record. The drawer had been locked the previous evening, with Alice's father keeping the only key on his person throughout the night. Dr. Edmund Harwick, summoned urgently from Manchester, conducted a series of exhaustive medical and psychological examinations over the course of 3 days. His findings, documented in a report to the Royal College of Physicians, stated unequivocally, "The child displays no symptoms of hysteria, dementia praecox, or any recognized form of mental aberration. Her cognitive faculties remain intact, her reasoning sound, her memory precise. She exhibits full awareness that her correspondents are deceased, yet maintains with disturbing calm that death presents no barrier to communication." The doctor's private notes, discovered years later, reveal his own growing unease as, "March 3rd. Alice knew about my brother's suicide before I mentioned having a brother at all. She handed me a letter she claimed he had dictated, containing details about his final hours that I have never shared with anyone. My hands shook as I read his apology for stealing my pocket watch when we were boys, a theft I had never reported, even to our parents. The household staff, meanwhile, began reporting increasingly disturbing phenomena. Doors found open that had been locked, wet footprints appearing in hallways when no one had been outside, and most terrifyingly, the sound of multiple voices emanating from Alice's room during the depths of night when the child was verifiably alone. 3 servants gave notice in March alone, with the under-gardener, William Crane, telling the local constable, "That girl speaks with the dead as naturally as you or I might chat with our neighbors, except her neighbors have been rotting in the ground for decades, and somehow, impossibly, they answer back." The events of April 1890 marked a dramatic escalation in the Alice Thornton affair, shifting from disturbing correspondence to physical manifestations that would ultimately involve both civil and ecclesiastical authorities. On the night of April 3rd, groundskeeper Thomas Morton, a decorated veteran of the Crimean War, known for his steady nerves and strict sobriety, was conducting his routine patrol of Whitmore Cemetery when he observed a small figure in white moving among the headstones. His sworn affidavit, filed with the Lancashire Constabulary on April 5th, describes following what he initially assumed was a vandal or grave robber, only to discover 13-year-old Alice Thornton kneeling at the grave of Margaret Blackthorne, who had died in 1842. Morton testified, "The child was speaking conversationally, as if someone was sitting right there beside her, pausing between statements as though listening to responses. When I approached with my lantern, she turned to me with perfect calm and said, 'Mrs. Morton, Mrs. Blackthorne says you needn't feel guilty about your brother anymore. She's seen him, and he forgives you for Sebastopol.'" Morton, who had never spoken to anyone in Whitmore about his brother's death in the Crimean War or his role in it, fled the cemetery and refused to return to his post for 3 days. But even more disturbing than Alice's nocturnal conversations were the physical traces left behind. On the morning of April 7th, Morton discovered that 17 graves showed signs of disturbance. Not excavation, but something far stranger. The earth above each grave appeared freshly turned from below, as if something had pushed up through the soil. Yet the surfaces remained unbroken. At each of these sites, partially buried at precisely the depth of 6 inches, cemetery workers discovered sealed letters in Alice's distinctive handwriting. The letters, when examined by authorities, contained specific requests from the deceased to their living relatives, including the location of hidden wills, confessions of past indiscretions, and in 3 cases, warnings about impending dangers that subsequently proved accurate. Father Benedict Walsh, the parish priest at St. Michael's, attempted an intervention on April 15th, arriving at the cemetery with holy water and prayers of exorcism, just as Alice was beginning another of her nocturnal visits. His official report to the diocese, though couched in careful theological language, barely conceals his terror. The child showed no fear of the Blessed Sacraments. Indeed, she seemed amused by my presence. As I began the Ritual Romanum, she interrupted to inform me that Father Douglas says you're pronouncing the Latin incorrectly, just as you did when he tried to teach you in 1868. Father Douglas had been my Latin instructor at seminary, dead these 12 years. The child then proceeded to correct my pronunciation with such precision that I found myself unable to continue. Most disturbing of all, as we departed the cemetery, I observed clear impressions in the mud beside several graves, footprints that led from the graves toward the path, though none returned. The revelation that shattered any remaining pretense of rational explanation came on May the 4th, 1890, when Charles Thornton, in a desperate attempt to prove his daughter's activities were elaborate fabrication, commissioned Mr. Aldrich Pemberton, a handwriting expert from Scotland Yard who had testified in numerous forgery cases, to examine the growing collection of return correspondence that had been appearing in Alice's room. Pemberton's analysis, conducted over 4 days with the most modern techniques available to forensic science, reached a conclusion that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. The letters were authentic, written in the actual hands of the deceased, matching perfectly with documented samples of their writing held in family archives, legal documents, and parish records. The letter purportedly from Judge Cornelius Ashworth, dead since 1873, contained not only his distinctive backward slanting script and peculiar habit of crossing his T's twice, but also referenced details from sealed court proceedings that had never been made public, including the true identity of a protected witness in a murder trial from 1869. Even more impossibly, a letter from Elizabeth Thornton, Charles's own mother who had died when he was 7, contained pressed between its pages a specific variety of Yorkshire rose that had grown extinct in 1878, yet here it was, fresh as if picked that very morning. The Thornton family, facing social ruin and unable to comprehend the supernatural horror unfolding within their walls, attempted complete isolation, dismissing all but the most essential servants and forbidding Alice from leaving the manor grounds. Eleanor Thornton's journal from this period reveals a woman on the verge of complete mental collapse. May 15th, Alice received 17 letters today through locked doors and sealed windows. One was from my stillborn son, describing the nursery we had prepared for him that was dismantled before Alice was born. He said he visits it often, in whatever realm he inhabits. I cannot stop weeping. The Lancashire Constabulary, summoned by concerned servants who had fled the house, conducted a thorough investigation led by Inspector James Harrington, a man of impeccable reputation who had solved numerous cases of fraud and deception. His official report, filed on May 22, 1890, presents a stunning admission of complete bewilderment. After extensive investigation, including around-the-clock surveillance of the Thornton Manor, searches for accomplices, and examination for any means of trickery or fraud, I must conclude that no earthly explanation exists for the phenomena observed. Letters continue to appear in sealed rooms under direct observation, written in hands that forensic science confirms belong to individuals deceased for decades. Most disturbing of all, these letters contain information that subsequent investigation proves accurate, including the location of 3 bodies from unsolved murders, details that the deceased writers would have taken to their graves. The report concludes with an unprecedented recommendation that the matter be transferred to ecclesiastical authorities, as it had moved beyond the realm of criminal investigation into territories that civil law is unequipped to address. Against the desperate wishes of Father Walsh and the explicit warnings of Dr. Harwick, Charles Thornton made the fateful decision to contact Helena Blackwood, the renowned spiritualist medium whose seances in London had attracted even members of the Royal Society for Psychical Research. Madame Blackwood arrived at Whitmore Manor on June 18, 1890, accompanied by her assistant, Marcus Crane, and stenographer, Miss Julia Fairweather, whose shorthand records of what transpired would later become evidence in the coroner's inquest. Blackwood's initial assessment, recorded in her private papers, expressed unusual apprehension. The child Alice is not a medium in any sense, I understand. She does not channel spirits, rather she appears to exist simultaneously in both the world of the living and the dead, as if death itself has somehow marked her as its own ambassador. Despite her reservations, Blackwood proceeded with a formal séance on the night of June 21st, the summer solstice, gathering in the Manor's drawing room with Alice, her parents, Dr. Harwick, Margaret Fielding, and 3 additional witnesses from the Society for Psychical Research. What happened over the next 3 hours would leave 3 participants permanently committed to psychiatric institutions, and the remainder sworn to silence by legal decree until their deaths. The séance began conventionally enough, with Blackwood attempting to establish contact with the spirits allegedly corresponding with Alice. But within minutes, according to multiple witness testimonies, the temperature in the room plummeted so dramatically that breath became visible, and frost formed on the windows despite the warm June evening. Alice, seated at the center of the circle, suddenly rigid, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. And when she spoke, 7 distinct voices emerged simultaneously from her throat, each clearly audible and identifiable as different deceased residents of Whitmore. Dr. Harwick's medical notes describe the impossibility. The child's larynx cannot physically produce such a phenomenon. Multiple distinct voices, male and female, young and old, speaking in overlapping but comprehensible streams. The stenographer's transcript reveals the content of these utterances, precise details of how each speaker died, accusations of murders never discovered, and most terrifyingly, specific prophecies about the impending deaths of those present. At exactly 11:47 p.m., as recorded by multiple witnesses, every piece of glass in the room, windows, mirrors, drinking vessels, simultaneously shattered, and in the reflection of the fragments, witnesses swore they saw faces of the dead pressing against the boundaries of our world. Marcus Crane, Blackwood's assistant, began screaming that invisible hands were choking him, showing distinct bruise marks on his throat that appeared before multiple witnesses. Julia Fairweather collapsed, blood streaming from her ears, speaking in Latin, despite having no knowledge of the language, reciting what Father Walsh later identified as the names of demons from medieval grimoires. Madame Blackwood herself, veteran of hundreds of séances, was found catatonic, her hair having turned completely white in the span of 3 hours, and she would never speak coherently again, spending her remaining years drawing endless pictures of doorways filled with reaching hands. The catastrophic séance of June 21st marked not an ending but a terrible acceleration of the phenomena surrounding Alice Thornton, as July brought with it a series of letters that would empty Whitmore of nearly half its population by summer's end. On July 2nd, Alice penned 43 identical letters, each delivered by hand to specific households throughout the town, each containing the same ominous opening line, "The dead of Whitmore are gathering, and they demand their due." What followed were precise, dated predictions of impending deaths, written with such clinical detachment that Dr. Harwick would later describe them as reading more like shipping manifests than prophecies. Mrs. Margaret Wellingham would suffer a fatal fall down her cellar stairs on July 9th at precisely 3:17 p.m. Young Timothy Blackstone would drown in the mill pond on July 14th, despite being an accomplished swimmer. The Reverend Michael Ashford would collapse during evening service on July 19th, his heart stopping mid-sermon. As July progressed, and each prophecy fulfilled itself with horrifying accuracy, panic gripped Whitmore with an intensity not seen since the Black Death. Margaret Wellingham, warned of her fate, barricaded herself in her bedroom, refusing to go near any stairs, only to inexplicably sleepwalk to the cellar on July 9th, her terrified family unable to wake her until they heard the fatal crash at exactly 3:17 p.m. Timothy Blackstone's parents sent him to relatives in London, but the boy mysteriously appeared back in Whitmore on July 14th, walking as if in a trance, directly to the mill pond, where multiple witnesses watched him walk into the water and sink without struggle, despite desperate attempts to save him. The Reverend Ashford's death was perhaps the most disturbing, as he collapsed while reading from Revelations, but not before changing his prepared sermon to repeatedly state, "They are here, in this very church, filling every pew we cannot see." By August, Alice's letters had evolved from individual predictions to warnings of something she called the Great Convergence, scheduled for September 16th. When the door that scarlet fever opened will welcome them all through. The remaining population of Whitmore faced an impossible choice: abandon their homes and livelihoods based on the prophecies of a 13-year-old girl, or risk becoming part of her growing catalog of accurate predictions. The exodus began on August 10th, with entire families loading their belongings onto carts, abandoning properties held for generations, fleeing something they couldn't see but had learned to believe in through terrible demonstration. Meanwhile, Alice herself began showing signs of severe physical deterioration, her weight dropping precipitously despite normal appetite, her hair falling out in clumps, and most unnervingly, her skin developing a translucent quality that Dr. Harwick described as allowing visibility of the vascular system beneath, as if she were becoming less solid, less present in our physical realm. By August 31st, 3/4 of Whitmore stood empty, and Alice, now confined to her bed, continued writing letters with hands that seemed to fade in and out of visibility, her very existence flickering like a candle in a storm. September 15th, 1890. would be remembered as Alice Thornton's final day of coherent communication with the world of the living, and what she revealed in those last hours would fundamentally challenge everything Dr. Edmund Harwick thought he understood about the boundaries between life and death. At dawn, Alice summoned the doctor to her bedside with a clarity she hadn't displayed in weeks, her voice strong despite her body having become so translucent that Harwick could see the pillow through her head. "Doctor," she began, as recorded in his verbatim notes, "I must tell you the truth before the door opens completely. During my fever, when everyone thought I had died for those 3 minutes, I did die. But death, Dr. Harwick, is not what we believe it to be. It's merely a room with 2 doors, one leading back to life, one leading onward to what comes after. But I found a 3rd door, one that should never exist, a door that opens both ways simultaneously." She explained that during her fever-induced death, she had encountered masses of Whitmore's dead, trapped in what she called the waiting place, unable to move forward, held by unfinished business, unanswered questions, and undelivered messages. They had been gathering for decades, perhaps centuries, pressing against the boundaries of death, seeking someone who could carry their words back. When I died, even for those 3 minutes, I became that conduit. But the door I opened doesn't close, Doctor. It only opens wider." At precisely noon, Alice directed Dr. Harwick to the manor's cellar, to a wall that had supposedly been solid stone since the house's construction in 1742. Following her detailed instructions, he located a hidden mechanism that revealed a chamber no one knew existed, its walls lined floor to ceiling with thousands of letters, some appearing to date back centuries, all addressed to the living from the dead, all in different hands, different languages, different eras. The papers seemed to materialize, even as Harwick watched, new letters appearing from thin air, piling upon each other in an endless cascade of correspondence from beyond. Alice's mother, Eleanor, watching her daughter fade more with each passing hour, pleaded with her to explain how to close this terrible door she had opened. Alice's response, recorded by Margaret Fielding, chills even in transcription. "Mother, you don't understand. I am the door now. Tomorrow, when the sun sets on September 16th, the door will open completely, and I will cease to be Alice and become only the threshold." As September 15th drew to a close, Alice made one final request, that everyone leave the manor before dawn, that no one attempt to follow or find her, and that the house be sealed permanently. At exactly midnight, witnesses reported that Alice's room filled with a soft, phosphorescent light, and the sound of hundreds, perhaps thousands of voices could be heard whispering in languages both familiar and unknown, all speaking at once, all calling a single name: Alice. When dawn broke on September 16th, 1890, Alice Thornton was gone, and what remained defied all attempts at rational explanation. Her bed showed no signs of disturbance. Her window remained locked from the inside, and most impossibly, the very floorboards of her room had been transformed into what Dr. Harwick described as a substance resembling both wood and flesh, warm to the touch and pulsing with a rhythm disturbingly similar to a heartbeat. The initial search party, comprising local constables and volunteers, found no trace of Alice within the manor or its grounds, but they discovered something far more disturbing. Every mirror in the house now reflected rooms full of people dressed in the fashions of different eras, all moving about as if conducting their daily lives, completely unaware of the living observers watching them through the glass. The investigation that followed would claim 7 lives within a single year, each death more inexplicable than the last. Inspector Harrington, who had led the initial police inquiry, was found dead in his locked study on November 3rd, 1890. His body discovered sitting at his desk, having somehow written a 17-page letter in Alice's handwriting, despite multiple witnesses confirming he had been alone. Dr. Edmund Harwick survived until February 1891, but his final journal entries descended into incomprehensible rambling about doors within doors within doors, before he was discovered in his laboratory, aged 30 years in a single night, clutching a letter addressed to him from his future self, describing his own death in perfect detail. By March 1891, parliamentary decree ordered Whitmore Manor sealed permanently, its windows bricked over, its doors welded shut, and a legal injunction prohibiting any entry for a minimum of 100 years. The official report, classified until 1990, concluded with the extraordinary admission that certain locations exist where the fundamental laws governing life and death have been irreparably damaged, and Whitmore Manor must be considered such a location. The town of Whitmore itself never recovered. With fewer than 100 residents remaining by 1892, most reporting continued correspondence from dead relatives appearing under their doors, in their pockets, and occasionally written across their walls in the night. But the story doesn't end in 1891. In 2019, when urban developers finally received permission to renovate Whitmore Manor, construction crews discovered something that shouldn't exist. Fresh letters, dated from every single day between September 16, 1890, and March 15, 2019, all signed Alice Thornton, aged 13, forever, all describing in meticulous detail the daily activities of everyone who had ever lived in Whitmore, as if she were still watching, still writing, still serving as the doorway between the living and the dead. The workers fled after discovering a final letter, addressed to whoever would find it, containing a single line. The door remains open, and I am still here, waiting to deliver their messages. The manor stands empty once again, but locals report seeing lights in the windows that should be bricked over, and every morning fresh letters appear at the gate. If you found this story as unsettling as the truth it reveals, consider subscribing to our channel, where we uncover more of history's most disturbing and inexplicable cases, the ones they never taught you in school.